Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Heather. Thanks, Heather. Today, we're going to be talking about the Green Label Game Jam. And I want to give a shout out to Slashes with Claws, who emailed me at our Gmail address, badideashow@gmail.com, and suggested that we cover this. I had heard about this way back in the day, but I dug even more into it, and man, is this an interesting story, Tony.
I'm not sure I've actually heard of it. It seems like something I've heard of peripherally, but I might just be thinking of like NBA Jam or any of these other games that throw jam at the end. So, could be crossed wires.
So, we should start with the definition of what a game jam is, Tony. Do you know what a game jam is?
I do not.
A game jam is an event where indie game developers get together and for a limited amount of time, usually between 24 and 72 hours, they have to make a game.
I've heard of these before.
It's just caffeine-fueled coding, basically nonstop thinking, brainstorming, trying to come up with a cool concept, and it's obviously not like going to come up with the next Call of Duty. That's not the kind of game you're making here. These are concept-driven games. A lot of them are going to be very simple, but hopefully structured around an interesting idea, and it's really just about getting those creative juices flowing. You're in a room with a lot of other people who are also trying to do this. Sometimes it's a competition, sometimes it's not, but it's really all about this creative spirit and solving these problems in a very limited amount of time. And indie game developers really seem to enjoy working under these kinds of conditions.
I think that's actually a thing for a lot of different creative pursuits, because a couple weeks back at one of the comic shops in town, they had a lock-in where it was 24 hours to finish and write and fully draft your comic.
Right, and there's also National Novel Writing Month, where you have to write an entire novel in a month, and there's, I believe, a 48-hour novel writing competition, which is just lock yourself in a hotel and write for 48 hours. So these kinds of very limited bursts of creative output are nothing new. And the Green Label Game Jam was meant to bring this world of intense coding and creating in this very short amount of time to a wider audience. It was something that really most people might have heard of, but they hadn't gotten to experience for themselves. They might not even know how to code, but they might be interested in seeing kind of how it worked. And so these two guys who were interested in the indie game scene, Josh Mattingly and David DeCarmine, came up with a show that would showcase what it took to make a game, even a small game. And they planned to take cameras inside of a game jam and just show people how it worked. And I want to point out that this idea, in its conception at least, was not a bad idea. I don't think. This was a very interesting concept. It's a concept that I would still be interested in to this day. I think it has been done since then, and I have not hunted down any of the successful iterations of the idea, but this one ended up not working out very well, Tony.
I'm just wondering, what went wrong here? Did they, do the drug smuggling thing with all the Ritalin and had some overdoses? What could possibly go wrong at a game jam?
Well, in a sense, the downfall of the Green Label Game Jam, also just titled Game_Jam, and if you hear me say Game Jam later on as the name of this thing, that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to say Game_Jam again in the podcast, Tony. But the problem with it was that it was such a good idea. It was such a good idea that it seemed like a shame to do it as just a low-key production with almost no money. So these two guys who initially came up with it, Josh Mattingly and David DeCarmine, partnered up with Maker Studios and a subsidiary of Maker called Polaris. Maker Studios was huge on YouTube at the time, and they were looking to get even bigger. And they said, hey, why don't we make this thing and make it really big?
Yeah, whenever you were describing it, it felt like this would be a better YouTube series than something that you could put on, another network, or at least before G4 died.
Right. So somewhere along the way, the concept of what the Green Label Game Jam was supposed to be started to change. Maker had a lot to gain if Game Jam was a hit, but they were investing a substantial amount of money into the project, so they had to be sure it was successful. So, when you want to make a YouTube product successful, Tony, what do?
I wouldn't know.
You put YouTubers in it. So they started to add YouTube personalities like Markiplier, JonTron, and Total Biscuit to the cast. And I didn't have a complete list of every single person who was involved here, so if I've left somebody out that you know was involved, it's because I didn't research enough, all right? I spent quite a bit of time studying this, but there's a lot that went into it, so...
And also, those are 3 big names. You only need 3 big ones when making a list generally.
Yes.
Rest in peace, Total Biscuit.
And since those YouTubers couldn't actually code or make a game at all, they introduced other elements to the show, like crafts and competitive gaming.
Okay. I can understand the competitive gaming, but not so much the crafts.
Well, you haven't watched enough reality competition TV shows, Tony. It's like in Hell's Kitchen, where they have the live farm animals and the people have to catch the animals that represent the dish they're going to make. It's not actually what any chef would ever do, but it's entertaining for the people at home.
Yeah, like the one where they had them in like a wind tunnel so that they had to cook in like hurricane force winds. Doesn't make any sense, but okay.
And speaking of competitive cooking shows, in addition to adding all of this nonsense with extra YouTubers and gaming and crafts, they decided they were going to make the Green Label Game Jam a competitive show. It was going to have teams of people competing against each other in the standard game show format that you're all familiar with, where they have a mini challenge and then they have a bigger challenge and they go before the judges and somebody gets a benefit and somebody loses and they go off and talk about each other and cry or whatever. That's what they were going to do. By the time Maker was done jazzing up the Green Label Game Jam, the coding portion of the show was almost completely eliminated. Only 1 day of the 4 days of filming would be spent actually making a game.
That's quite the process to get to just, wiping out the entire point of the thing in the first place.
I know, right? You would think you had a good idea. You started with this good idea, which was people make games real short amount of time. We take camera, we film that, we edit to look good, and then put on YouTube. That probably would have been great, Tony. But because they needed it to be a hit, like a big hit, like a profitable hit, they started moving things around to make it more palatable to more people and more interesting, and it got more and more and more like a reality show and less like an actual game jam. Meanwhile, the coders that would ostensibly be the ones making the games had very little idea of how the idea was evolving. They expected the televised event wouldn't be a perfect representation of a real game jam, but it seems that the magnitude of how heavily produced the event was hit them harder than they expected. And there were problems even before the camera started rolling. The second that the contestants showed up on set, they were expected to sign contracts that were far more restrictive than some of them were willing to accept. There was the obvious clause that the show might, quote-unquote, misrepresent their words and actions to create more drama on screen.
The standard reality TV show thing.
Yes. By the way, worth watching at least the first season of a show called Unreal to get a window into how this sometimes happened. It is, in fact, a scripted show about reality TV, but you really get a sense of how slimy the people behind the cameras can be trying to create some kind of drama. Hopefully, the scripted Unreal is actually worse than real life, but it's a good show still.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the major stuff that came out there where they had people starting fights on Jersey Shore and everything where people ended up getting punched in the face, they seem pretty slimy.
The bigger issue, though, was that the contestants weren't allowed to represent themselves in any digital media during the airing of the show and 2 weeks thereafter.
Like, they weren't able to tweet about what they did, or what?
They weren't able to tweet. They weren't able to upload YouTube videos. They weren't able to upload a game. Anything that would be seen as them representing themselves online during the time that Game Jam was airing was a breach of contract. Now, this is weird because Maker is the ones who are creating this contract, and they actually had some of these YouTubers on their payroll, so the YouTubers have to sign this contract too that says they won't represent themselves, and their whole job is to upload YouTube videos, and they're not going to stop for like 4 or 5 weeks while this show shows up. It seemed like the kind of thing that might not have been actually enforced, but these indie game developers weren't used to that kind of thing, and they really took issue with the idea that they weren't going to be able to represent themselves, and they pushed back hard. Now, I don't know who was in charge at this point of the Game Jam and who was drafting these contracts. I do know that several years later, Bernie Burns of Rooster Teeth was in The Amazing Race, and during the time that he was on the show, he tweeted about the episode pretty frequently. That was almost certainly why they got him and other quote-unquote social influencers to be on the show, was so that they would tweet to their fans and get them to watch the show and talk about things like, oh yeah, you guys didn't see this behind the scenes, but it was actually a lot more difficult than it looked, or yeah, we got lost here and they had to leave that on the cutting room floor. That was actually really interesting. I didn't end up watching the show at the time, Tony, so maybe it didn't work out as well as they would have liked, but it seems like a bad idea to get people who live on the internet, who make their livelihood on the internet, and then say, yeah, but you guys can't be on the internet for like several weeks while we air this show and 2 weeks after, so yeah.
Especially because just disappearing for a month can absolutely destroy a channel.
Yeah. Yeah,
like,
it can.
It makes more sense for like the Ultimate Fighter, where they go into a house and they're not allowed to talk to anyone outside of it for 6 weeks, partially because the people that owned the UFC prior to this owned casinos and they wanted the sports books to not have any spoilers. But there's a lot that's going on there where it's like, I don't understand why like they wouldn't be able to talk to people that are at their home and all that. But for them, they're going to be on TV weeks and weeks later, and they can tweet about it as much as they want based on that once it's out. But they don't have a presence online where they have to maintain.
Right, and so the Game Jam contestants pushed back on this, and they did manage to win quite a few concessions. There was compromises on both sides, and eventually they got a contract that everybody was at least willing to sign. They might not have been 100% happy with it, but it dealt with some of their problems. But it was a bad omen for how things were going to be going, because the next day brought even more problems for the Game Jammers. For one thing, the equipment started to fall apart. The computers, you know, those things that you actually need to make computer games with, they started breaking.
I don't know about you, but I just make computer games with cards, put them into the machine, hole punches.
Yeah, you're just writing down your code on like a notebook.
Yeah.
I think that's how Bill Gates demoed the first like Microsoft DOS. They realized they didn't have a bootloader, and it wasn't Gates, it was his partner at the time, I want to say Paul Allen, who on the plane ride over there realized they hadn't included a bootloader, and so wrote out the instructions for the bootloader on like a legal pad on the plane as they were going, and just typed it into the computer and hoped that it worked.
Did it work?
It did.
That's awesome.
That's how come you've heard of Bill Gates now, Tony. To make matters worse, the headsets that had been provided for the YouTubers to record gameplay with were apparently of terrible quality. The guy who reported the most of this, and I'll include a link to the long expose article as well as some of the other ones that I drew information from, he talked about how Markiplier was comparing the audio that he could get through this headset to his iPhone, and talking about how the iPhone was a much better recording device than the terrible, terrible headset that these people had bought them to use.
I've been in that situation before. Like, we had to start switching to camera phones instead of webcams. It just wasn't working.
And then there was the issue of branding. This is probably a good place to mention that at some point in the process of developing the Green Label Game Jam, Maker had sold sponsorship rights to Pepsi. And so the entire Game Jam set was decked out with Mountain Dew Green. Center stage stood directly underneath a huge Mountain Dew logo, and all the prizes for the various challenges were Mountain Dew related.
I can understand if some of them were Mountain Dew related, or even if the tables were all green, but to have everything related to Mountain Dew is just a little bit much, even for people who are doing coding.
Adriel Wallach, who we'll hear more about in a little bit, wrote about this on her blog after the event had taken place, and she said, quote, "So there I was, standing on stage, waiting to be judged on a, quote, mini challenge, only marginally related to game development, with lights shining down and the cameras rolling. I was underneath a Mountain Dew sign, watching a team win their Mountain Dew lawn chairs where they could sip their brand new Dew pack of Mountain Dew. We were all vying for a grand prize only slightly more insulting than the aforementioned lawn chairs. End quote. So, you can imagine the problems that start popping up here. These are not people who object to making money, right? Like, indie game makers will sell their games. They will take your money and they will give you a product for it. But they're not the kind of people who are really on board with sort of the big scale corporate shilling that was going on with Game Jam. So there's this weird cognitive disconnect where these people who are making games mostly for the love of it or even for the art of it are expected to compete in these Mountain Dew branded challenges. I mean, Zoe Quinn is here of Depression Quest, okay? The guy who made the Stanley Parable is here. And then Adriel Wallach, I don't know a specific game that she's made, but she has a cool challenge where she makes a game a week. So she's, active in this indie gaming community in a way that is not big corporate shilly, and yet they've got a shill for big corporate. But Mountain Dew had paid for their product placement, and so there was somebody there to make sure that Mountain Dew got their product placement. And that person's name was Maddy Leshem. Now, it's probably not any single person's fault that the Green Label Game Jam turned out as poorly as it did, but if you're looking for a villain in this story, you can do a lot worse than Maddy Leshem.
It's always Maddy.
Maddy Leshem made sure that everyone was holding their Mountain Dew cans correctly with the label out. Maddy Leshem coached people so that they looked like they were enjoying their Mountain Dew. Maddy Leshem made Davey Redden, aforementioned designer of the Stanley Parable, take off his nail polish so it wouldn't distract from the Mountain Dew can he was holding.
What if they just gave him green green polish?
Apparently that wasn't an option, Tony. Maddy Leshem banned all non-Mountain Dew drinks from the set, including unlabeled water bottles and coffee. In addition to all of this, someone made Zoe Quinn, again, yes, that Zoe Quinn, take off the pins she wore on her jacket and tried to make her cover up her tattoos, but she yelled at them until they stopped. Things came to the breaking point when Maddy Leshem somehow took hold of the reins of directing Game Jam, and this is something that I have not been able to figure out. Maddy Leshem ends up in charge of creating drama on the set, and I don't know who put him in charge. It feels like he just decided that it was his job to make this a more interesting show, and so he started trying to pick fights between the contestants. First, he tried to get Zoe Quinn and YouTuber JonTron in a fight. The two had been put on a team together and they had legitimate disagreements about the direction their game should take, but when they tried to resolve it like adults away from the cameras, Maddy Leshem followed them and tried to prod them into demeaning each other in front of the cameras. It's worth pointing out that at this point, Zoe Quinn was embroiled in a backlash to her posting of the game Depression Quest on Steam Greenlight, which would later feed into the Gamergate controversy. So her and JonTron were both in kind of a weird position. They were disagreeing about their game, but Zoe Quinn didn't want to be seen as the girl who was hating on JonTron, a very popular male YouTuber, and JonTron didn't really want to be seen as the guy who was hating on Zoe Quinn, because she has a lot of fans on the other side.
Yeah, that sounds like a PR nightmare.
Yeah, so both of them are trying to solve this amicably, and despite the fact that they didn't really seem to like each other that much, they were at least trying to give each other enough space where Zoe Quinn didn't get death threats and JonTron didn't get chased off of YouTube, although he may have done some stuff to get him chased off of YouTube since then. Anyway, there's several people in this episode that has done things besides Game Jam that we're not going to talk about too much, Tony. Maddy Leshem even took JonTron into another room and pushed him in front of the cameras solo to dump on Zoe, and JonTron was like, nah, not doing it. You're not going to push me into this.
What they should have done is just started dumping on the director. See if any of that made it in.
Leshem then turned his attention to the only other team with a girl on it. Adriel Wallach had worked at NASA before taking on game design full-time, and she had created Train Jam, a game jam session that happened on a 52-hour train ride, which just incidentally, I'd love to say, I'll go not design a game for 52 hours on a train. That sounds delightful. Maddy Leshem didn't know or didn't care about any of that. Instead, he asked, "Do you think you're at an advantage because you have a pretty girl on your team?" to her teammates. Again, a quote from Adriel Wallach's blog that she posted after the fact about this incident. Quote, "All love to my teammates as they declined to engage, but after pushing more, he got a rise out of me. He got me to, with an embarrassed and flushed red face, launch into a statement about how his question is indicative of everything that is wrong in our industry in terms of sexism. That no, we weren't at an advantage because we had a woman on our team. We were at an advantage because I'm a damn fine programmer and game developer. We were at an advantage because my skill allowed us to be at an advantage, not my pretty face." End quote.
Yeah, considering she can pump out a game a week, it sounds like she's pretty well versed in what she does.
Also built stuff that went into space, Tony.
Yeah, that kind of helps too. It's like the guy who did the glitter bombs.
Needless to say, the atmosphere was now more tense than ever. But Leshem didn't stop pushing. Instead, he went to the other teams and said, "Two of the other teams have women on them. Do you think they're at a disadvantage?"
Such baiting questions.
They were shocked that he was even able to ask the question, right? Like, they're just, "How are you saying these things out loud in 2014? Shut up, my dude." And Nidhogg creative director Mark Essen, who was there to judge one of these competitions, replied, trying to smooth the situation over, that the teams with the girls on them might have had a better chance of winning because they had a more diverse set of viewpoints. And Leshem cuts him off and says, "Stop filming. We're not getting a story here."
I mean, the story really is Leshem now. Like, they should have just turned the camera to it and just been like, okay, get as much film of him being a jack. Oh, I can't say it on this podcast. Get as much film of him being a jerk as possible, and we'll make the entire thing that. Make him the focus. Roast him.
It seems that way. I think that there was a certain element even before Leshem really got involved as heavily as he did, that the contestants weren't thrilled to be there. I found a website, and I hesitate to cite this because it came from a fairly hateful Gamergate site where everybody was hating on Zoe Quinn. But they had what they claimed was a leaked text conversation between her and someone else where she admitted that she was being as goofy and uncooperative as possible about the product placement and the Mountain Dew holding, where she would hold the cans in such a way that it was either obvious that she was being forced to do it or was just like unusable footage because she really was annoyed at what she was being made to do.
It's the Daniel Radcliffe wear the same clothes every day so the paparazzi can't get new shots thing.
Yes, to be fair, I don't know if that is even true because the site that it came from was looking for a reason to dump on Zoe Quinn. They might have made it up.
Were they even dumping on that? That seems just like it's having fun with it.
It seems like it to me, but you have not delved into the pits of Gamergate. I dipped a toe researching this into the Gamergate discussion, and I am still needing to take like another shower because, gah. Some bitter people in that world, Tony. Not what we're talking about today, though.
That could definitely be a bad ideas episode, though.
Eventually, the different groups started to compare notes, and Leshem's bad behavior really was amplified. A lot of this stuff kind of happened in pockets, where one person would hear one thing he was saying, and another person would hear another thing he was saying, and everybody's just kind of trying to write it off. But one of the production assistants sort of gets the people together and says, "Hey, listen, do you realize what's going on here? What this guy's doing and what he's saying and what he said to these other people?" And so Zoe and Adriel and a couple other people walk off the set. They say, "This isn't worth it. Whatever contract we signed is not worth it. We're not doing this. This guy is a royal pain in our butts, and we are not going to put up with this nonsense. It was bad enough that we had to be corporate shills. Now he's being a sexist jerk. It's hard enough being a woman in the game industry anyway, I've heard. So no, thank you. You may have your Green Label Game Jam. We will be off somewhere else."
Good for them. Like, you gotta take a stand whenever it's just so dumb. Like, it's not adding anything to that. Although he probably liked that they were leaving so he could get some more controversy out of that.
Well, the fact that they left meant that they didn't really have a show. And when they left, the other producers on the Game Jam set just panicked because they realized that the millions of dollars that they had invested in this was about to go down the tubes. They fired Leshem. They said, listen, we'll get rid of the guy. What do we got to do to get you guys to come back? Please, please, please don't leave. But by that point, the damage had been done, and Game Jam was toast. They had 1 day of filming out of the scheduled 4. It never aired. It was a huge disaster. Maker does not fail because of this, although they do end up being bought by Disney and then sort of phased out of existence. I don't know if that's karma or not, Tony. I think it's just how business works. But if you're interested in what happened to Maker, they're not really around anymore. Maddy Leshem is still around doing weird corporate synergy stuff. I don't know what corporate synergy is exactly, but that's what he's doing, Tony.
Yeah, it's just slapping them buzzwords together to make people feel like they're going to work better and stronger because they went to a conference.
The thing that weirded me out the most about this was the stuff that would have been the easiest to fix. The fact that he wanted to promote Mountain Dew, that's perfectly acceptable to a certain way of thinking, right? Like, people sponsor events, they want to get their money's worth. But guess what? It's not great to drink Mountain Dew nonstop for like 4 days straight. It's a nice drink. I like Mountain Dew. I'm not bashing Mountain Dew, but you should drink other things. And that's why a lot of times when soft drinks sponsor people, they give them cans with water in them that just look like the soft drink. I don't understand why they hadn't done that for this. It seems like an obvious solution to an obvious problem, but apparently nobody on set had thought of it.
Or, just let them have a can on the desk and a bottle of water. Nobody's going to judge them for having both. I have that on my desk right now. I have a thing of coffee, a thing of water, and a thing of Diet Dr. Pepper right in front of me.
I have an obscenely large cup of coffee, Tony, and nothing else. Well, nothing else food related. There's quite a bit of clutter.
Also, if they're under a giant Mountain Dew logo, they don't need to triple up on logos in the frame.
Right, and sponsorship doesn't even have to be about drinking the drink, right? Like, Red Bull produced some movies about snowboarding where none of the snowboarders ever take a sip of Red Bull. They're just wearing Red Bull branded stuff and doing radical things. That's not how branding synergy works, just to see people happy drinking Mountain Dew. I don't think that's really what Mountain Dew wanted. It's definitely not what these developers wanted, but somehow this is what they ended up with.
Is that why it was Green Label Gaming, by the way?
I think so, but I actually don't know for sure. I was not able to find an exact reason why that was called that or when it was labeled Green Label Game Jam. I just know that that is what it was going to be called by the time they were in production. But that is it. That is all I have for this week on Green Label Game Jam. I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe on whatever podcast platform you prefer. You can also go over to the YouTube channel where we have the audio uploads on our YouTube channel, the Bad Ideas Show YouTube channel. And if you have bad ideas that you would like us to cover, you can suggest them at badideashow@gmail.com. Once again, this was suggested by Slashes with Claws, and we want to thank him or her, I'm not sure, whoever has claws, for suggesting this bad idea.
Also, the YouTube channel is at bit.ly Bad Ideas Show.
Oh, cool. We don't have a custom URL on YouTube yet. We will one day. Not today, though.
Also, if you enjoy this show, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes. $2, $5, $10 a month. It gets you access to the bonus podcast. It gets you a lot of other cool stuff, pins, and postcards, and so much more. It also helps keep the lights on here. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for being patrons. Thank you for leaving reviews. We will talk to you guys very soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye.